What is a sundown town, and why did you decide to write this article?
So, sundown towns are towns where either um, on paper, in a law, or in housing contracts, Black people basically weren't allowed to live there. They're called sundown towns because oftentimes Black people were allowed to work there, usually in butler or nanny capacities, but they weren't allowed to own homes there. So if they were there after sundown, um, they would either be escorted out by law enforcement, escorted out by the threat of violence by an angry mob, or actually faced real violence. And I wanted to write about this because a lot of the time when we talk about racism and our country's history with it, we don't talk about how racism looked in the North. We often think about, the dogs and the fire hoses and the civil rights movements down south, but we don't think about the fact that, as me, I'm someone who lives in Detroit about a mile from Grosse Pointe. We don't talk about the fact that if this was 60 years ago, me living a mile from Grosse Pointe would mean my life had all sorts of factors that I would have to think about on a daily basis.
What is the difference between what we're talking about when it comes to sundown towns versus segregation, or as you referenced, the racism that people were facing down south?
So I think the big difference is the legality, right? So sundown towns didn't all have the same laws and same practices, but what kind of gives them the term sundown town is that somewhere they were explicitly being anti-Black, whether it was in housing policies. For instance, a lot of the Grosse Pointes and a lot of Detroit suburbs had it in housing contracts that you weren't allowed to sell this home to a Black family, even when Black families could afford to buy the house. Or other times, there were laws literally saying Black people aren't allowed to be here after dark. Um, so when we think about segregation, a lot of the time, we're talking about sometimes accidental segregation, where people lived in these areas because they came in groups when they migrated to Detroit and migrated north. But with a sundown town, it's very purposeful. It is very much so. If you are a white middle class family, we are gonna give you this house, even if the Black family that wants to buy it can pay us more money.
What policies bolstered the ability for sundown towns to exist? What laws were assisting in that oppression?
Redlining is certainly one practice that contributed to it, but I think the one that we really don't talk about as much is lending policies. Like I said, even when Black families could afford to buy these homes, banks wouldn't give them loans, not to live in these communities anyway. And when you think about the way that wealth is generated over generations, home ownership plays a big factor into that. So what essentially happened in Detroit and a lot of other places up north is you'll take a look at the urban core and you'll see that, okay, there's all of these Black families that live in this area. And then you look at the more affluent areas right outside of where they live, and Black people weren't allowed to generate wealth in areas that didn't already have all of these problems that big cities had. So
Right.
it's just one contributing factor to the current segregation we see, the current economic divide that we see, and quite frankly, the current racist attitudes of a lot of people in America.
So obviously today, Black people aren't being escorted to the edge of town by police officers, or being ran out by an angry mob. But how are some of the remnants of these sundown towns and that segregation still with us today?
So the one way that I saw it a lot growing up, especially when I got to high school and started driving to hang out with friends that lived in some of these suburbs, was racial profiling in police. And it's something that people really push back on this idea, but it's actually quite simple. If you live in a suburb, that is 90+% white, and you see a group of black kids driving through it, the police automatically look at them as outsiders, people who don't live here. What are they doing here this late at night? Why are they driving, in groups of young teens, And I think that actually is where a lot of the implicit bias against young black men particularly comes from when it comes to law enforcement. It's, you're in an area that historically you have never been in. What are you doing here? It automatically brings up suspicion. And instead of, seeing me as someone who's going home after visiting a friend, I'm now someone who's seen as a suspect in some wrongdoing.
So how are these suburbs changing their respective histories to, desegregate, to actually make places as welcoming as, some would claim? Like, have there been any tangible results that you came across while you were putting this together?
Yeah, so the tangible result part is kind of up in the air depending on who you are. If you're a very cynical old Detroiter, you're probably like, yeah, they're not really doing enough. And I would probably agree with that perspective, that they're not doing enough. But what you're seeing is efforts to really educate people on the history, and efforts to really have people in these communities talk about race and talk about racism and look at, all right, why does our neighborhood look this way? I talked to a woman from Grosse Pointe, which is probably one of the more notoriously racist places in the area. Not that they were anything special, like when you look at their history, they weren't doing anything way worse than other places. But when Detroiters talk about where not to drive at night, Grosse Pointe's probably one of the first places that comes to mind.
Right.
But I talk to people who live there, and they say that a lot of the effort isn't necessarily on the city officials or the elected officials, because they're so busy with just kind of the general day-to-day operations of the city and keeping things going, that it a lot of the time falls on the neighborhood groups to be more welcoming and to call out racism when they see it. When I was a kid, in the 2004 election was happening, you would drive through Grosse Pointe and you would just see Bush Cheney sign left and right. And you would almost exclusively see white homeowners. Now, it's still very majority white, but you see kind of an influx of young black homeowners in these places that historically they wouldn't have been allowed to be. And I kind of think of it as like the domino effect. When one all-white suburb starts to integrate more, it starts to happen around. So as far as efforts, some cities like Ferndale have really changed their reputation. Ferndale, to many people's surprise when I published the piece, was a sundown town. But now Ferndale is seen as this very progressive, liberal place where everyone is accepted, in large part because their acceptance of the LGBTQ community. And right. I don't know about you, but when I see a pride flag, I feel a lot safer because I'm like, if they like gay people, there's a chance they don't hate black people. It's not
right,
always true,
just a little
but
bit,
it's just a chance. Yeah. It makes me feel just a little bit more comfortable.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think a lot of these suburbs have really changed their reputation just with the influx of new people coming in.